today we're going to be discussing life together in a fragmented world. Human beings were made for living in community, and it's in community that we flourish. However, in any community, there are challenges. We often lack the skills and the virtues to make life together good. So in a deeply fractured world, the recovery of practices that build and sustain community is particularly important for us, and important to our Christian life and witness. So since we don't always recognize how important it is that those who follow Jesus are known for hospitality and welcome, fidelity, truthfulness, and gratitude and grace, we want to explore these themes today. And with us to guide us through that is Dr. Christine Pohl. She retired in the summer of 2018 after having taught Christian ethics at Asbury Theological Seminary in Kentucky for 29 years. Prior to her graduate studies, she was teaching at Asbury and teaching at Asbury. She was also involved in a congregational parachurch, congregational ministry, parachurch ministry, and refugee ministries. She has been published in those publications include Living into Community, Cultivating Practices That Sustain Us, Making Room, Recovering Hospitality as a Christian Tradition, and along with others, she has co-authored several books and a number of scholarly and popular articles. She speaks regularly about recovering the practices of hospitality in community, and it's really our pleasure to have her with us today as we explore these themes. We also have JR, of course, with us. He has been planting churches on the East Coast and West Coast. He is the author of Creating a Missional Culture, The Church as Movement, the co-author of The Church as Movement, and he's also the leader of the national director of the V3 Church Planting Movement. He's also a co-founder of the Praxis Gathering, which you'll hear about at the end of today's time together. And he's currently working on his PhD at University of Manchester, where he is today. So we will definitely we will enjoy hearing from them. And my name is Lori Ruffin. I am an operations manager with the V3 movement and the founder of the COO team. And so we're glad to be with you today. Without further ado, we're going to jump in to really explore these topics. At the end of our time, there will be an opportunity for you to ask questions. So if you look into your panel there, you may see something that says Q&A. If there's something that you hear that sparks a thought, sparks a question, I want to invite you to drop your question into that Q&A box, and we'll circle back at the end and answer as many questions as possible. And so with that, I'm going to spark us off. Life together in a fragmented world. Dr. Pohl, would love to know, what do you see as the major contributors to isolation and fragmentation?
It's a good question, and it has a lot of answers because there's a lot of things that contribute to how fragmented we are. And I would say that a couple of them are that the whole culture has been oriented, at least in the US, toward individuals and individualism and self-fulfillment. That doesn't set up a good way for us to think about the needs of community or the need for community, because we tend to focus and think our well-being is most connected to our own individual flourishing. And if you think that way, then you don't do the kinds of things that'll make communities strong. I think a lot of it now is also sort of how we choose to use our free time, whatever time that is, how we do entertainment and so on, which tends also to be pretty isolating, whether it's social media or any kinds of the various technologies that people are using. So I think those would be the first ones. I think also we like to make our own choices. And if you're connected to community, then in a sense you are deeply connected to what other people think is important and value. And we're a little hesitant to let anybody speak very much into our lives. And so I think all of that makes us pretty isolated. Maybe JR, you want to jump in and then I'll come back.
Sure. Yeah. Because when I think about that, because I know some of these questions are some of the questions people put in before our time. And it's a great question. And I agree too, like there's kind of the micro and the macro elements. And I think one of the macro things I would agree with too is, well, you kind of mentioned like the, free time. I think sometimes living under the power of the market that that has really shaped us. We have a lot of unquestioned assumptions on how much money we need, where we need to live, and all of that stuff that can really limit our time. But we don't often think about that. We could share our lives and share our belongings a little bit more to actually create more time to be with one another. So that's one thing. And then I think another big one is technology in all of its forms. Like I like the way Marshall McLuhan defines medium. Like, he's the one who coined the phrase, the medium is a message. And so, but a medium, he says, is simply an extension of ourselves. So like the phone is an extension of the ear and the mouth. The car is an extension of the foot. And just the power of one medium and how that shifts our life. Because I lived in LA for 10 years, and LA was pretty much designed by the car. The car, and it's very interesting. If you go to like New York or San Francisco and Chicago, we usually call these walking cities because they were created before the car. Cities after the car, like LA had its boom years, really when the movie industry moved from New York to LA. And I would say my experience in LA is like just the car itself has reshaped what life looks like in the city. It's fragmented the city. It makes it hard to be in community together. Someone will, work, 30, 40 minutes away. The people at their work lives another 40 minutes in another direction. And you spend like a decent amount of your time at work. So like the fragmentation of like where we live physically and where we live socially is, the technology has created tensions there. And then that kind of lends itself to even the micro issues. Like I enjoy using technology. I'm not like negative, but I just think we have to ask a lot of questions about its use. And so I'm kind of, I like to use some language apps when I'm kind of learning languages. And so I meet people from different cultures. And just a little story is like, there was a guy who I met who lived in Malaysia, and he just moved to Singapore. And so it was probably his first move in his life. And he just said like, JR, like, I was asking, how's Singapore? Because, Singapore is really quite a beautiful place. And he says, well, like, I'm pretty lonely. And he goes, I go, well, so, well, I haven't been able to make any friends. People don't, it's just hard. It's been hard for him to make friends. It's not quite like his hometown, which was probably a smaller place. And so I had to actually just give him skills on how to meet people and how to kind of be willing to take a risk and risk rejection and so forth. And I don't know what his faith background is. He's not necessarily a Christian, but it helped me to realize, and I kind of grew up like living all over the place. So I had to either learn to get to know people well or be quite lonely myself. So, but I just realized like sometimes it's just that really basic skill as well.
I think it requires an intentionality now that maybe it didn't in the past, because we're kind of starting from a different place. So if you don't think about it, and people don't necessarily have the skills to build relationships, I mean, they want it. I think that's the difficulty. People want it, but they don't necessarily have the skills to accomplish building relationships. But I think there's a couple other things. One is, I think the church, which has been such an important place for building community, has appeared to the world to be deeply fractured. And so oftentimes it doesn't seem like a safe place. So people, when they want community, are looking for safer places to connect. But it's kind of, as one person put it, it's like being connected without being encumbered. So you want connections, you don't necessarily want relationships that require very much of you. So there's a complexity with opting for things like cafes or bars or third spaces or whatever. I mean, the church actually looked for a much more robust version of community, but the fracturing has made it a little bit harder to be convincing that we've got what people are looking for, I think.
No,
Yeah,
I think
yeah.
I was just gonna say you really hit on the idea of even expectations, like what people are expecting today versus, you know, in the past. One question that, you know, I'd love to hear your perspective on is, you know, people can be quite idealistic about community. And so how can leaders best address this idealism so that participation is not a letdown, you know, and that there's not unforgiving expectations?
I think that's a big concern, because I think oftentimes when people are really hungry for something, they tend to idealize it. I don't think leaders necessarily realize how much of a problem this is, but you sure do encounter it when people are disappointed. And I think the disappointment often turns to cynicism about community. When you have impossible expectations and they're not fulfilled, people become cynical. But I think Bonhoeffer in Life Together, which is very insightful about some of the issues around community, really warns about idealizing Christian community so that you end up not appreciating what in fact you have. And everything becomes kind of sort of pale and paltry and inadequate compared to your, what he calls a wish dream, or that's how it gets translated anyway. You know, just this thing that you have sort of conjured up in your mind. But I think that leaders also have to take some responsibility, because sometimes they craft these idealized visions of community. And I think leaders have to be truthful. I think they have to be careful not to hide the hard stuff. I think they need to encourage people oftentimes to start small with more moderate expectations. And also that a lot of it's not dramatic. A lot of community building and living is not very dramatic. I mean, we oftentimes want something big and flashy and so on, and expect that somehow it's going to be the best pieces of the Book of Acts description of the first communities, and sort of forget that they really hadn't gotten very far into community before things started going really awry, and they were dealing with deception and privilege and so on right within the first chapters of the Book of Acts. So I think oftentimes there needs to be a lot of conversation about this, and a lot of appreciation for how much sort of we are doing, or the ways that we're building and so on.
Yeah, that's a good point, because I think sometimes in our kind of current age, like we can put like, and we should have like some values, but sometimes like you know, in a marketing age, we want to kind of put our first, you know, our best foot forward. And but I like in England, and maybe even I think there's a book called Messy Church, and it kind of is a little bit more like, it's a little bit more honest about what church is going to be like. So I think there is something to kind of grabbing a hold of, really kind of, you know, our hope is this, you know, the reality is this. And I think like you said, like you, if you actually, if we can kind of look at Acts 2, you know, 42, and like the beautiful picture, but then when you start to look through the letters, like there's a lot of tough, like, well, you got to learn how to forgive each other. Well, if I need to learn how to forgive, that's probably means somebody's done me wrong, and that's going to be a regular occurrence. And so I feel like, you know, just reading the scripture actually does give a more realistic picture, as you're saying. It happened really early in Acts. By the time some of the people were overlooked at the food distribution, to, you know, to much deeper problems that Paul is addressing in some of his other letters. But I always just, you know, help people realize that, like, you think the early church was, again, like this ideal place, but it had a lot of problems as well.
So it sounds like leaders can really help with that by keeping it real, you know, in essence.
Yeah, keeping it real, but also pointing to a vision of something good and beautiful. I mean, it's still, I think it's a tension that you kind of hold, being really truthful and honest about how frail and finite we are, but at the same time capturing people's imagination with a vision. So I think it's a challenge, actually.
Yeah,
So
definitely.
how do we handle people who come from backgrounds of hurt and failed relationships? So they're bringing that kind of baggage into community. How can we help them rebuild trust in community?
Yeah, everybody brings their stuff to community. And so the brokenness comes with the goodness. And I think that's again part of the challenge. I think you build trust with people who have been hurt by untrustworthy relationships by being trustworthy yourself. I mean, I really think that's where it starts. You need to keep your promises, to be truthful, not to sort of try to spin things, but really to be truthful, and to build a culture gradually, where people keep their word, where they're honest and responsible, and where fidelity is celebrated. I mean, the small acts of daily fidelity, I think, often go by unnoticed, but I think that really one of the things that you have to do with people, especially who have been hurt by broken relationships, is rebuild that fabric slowly and faithfully of really doing what you say you'll do, living out integrity. And I think it actually does start with the leadership. I think leaders have to do this. This is not just something that you might do, or other things can take precedence or something like that. No, this is really at the core of building a community. And the other thing that strikes me is that we have to be very careful about expectations. Lots of times expectations, again, in community aren't clear. And especially people who are coming out of broken relationships, they don't necessarily know what's expected of them. And so sometimes naming some of these issues and helping them own some of the struggles that they have and so on, but also the expectations of the community, can be important so that they don't end up making mistakes that they didn't even know they were doing.
Yeah, that's great.
JR, what would you add?
I think it's difficult. I think first of all, kind of being a good listener and really trying to hear people's story. I also think there's like space to create, for people to share their stories, because all of us have been, we all have been hurt, and as a result, we also hurt people. That's part of the human element, but and the closer we get to people, the more we tend to hurt them. It's kind of like two porcupines, you want to get close, but the popes come in the closer you get. So I do think that I think a couple of things. Number one, that the leader needs to be an example of building a close community themselves, and that becomes like a hot center to some of the rest of the community who may or may not be fully ready to be trusting relationships, but they think they need to see trusting relationships happening in community in order for them to kind of get the courage to kind of to move into that. But the hard cold fact is like there is no promises that it's going to not be hurtful and tough. Like I think even as a church planner, like the biggest emotional wounds is kind of being stabbed in the back by people that you've tried to love the most. And I think if I kind of read Paul right, I think the thing that got him to the point of close to wanting to to give his life and just end his life was the emotional trauma of probably people deserting him and people that he loved. He kind of uses a hyperbole like all of Asia deserted me, but I think his biggest issues were emotional, that dealt with the relationships of the people that he kind of gave himself to. And so I do think there's an element that I need to be willing, like Christ, who loved perfectly and yet, in the end was left alone, deserted by everybody. I don't love perfectly like Jesus. I want to continue, but I think in that moments of hurt, like even for myself, it's like fundamentally realizing how much Jesus went through and the hurt that he was willing to go through for me actually allows me to be grounded and not just in a mind way, but in a heart way, to know his love for me, so that I have the ability to love others, because I can only love to the degree, I think, that I understand God's love for me. And I think that's fundamental. And then in that love, I have to be willing to probably sacrifice, and to realize, like, not everybody's going to return that. Most people may not. God might provide some great relationships, trust, and he has, but there's a lot of times, if I'm going to be real, like, there's a lot that isn't coming back, but I don't live with that mindset of what I'm going to get out of it. I feel like for me, like Paul was willing to kind of give his life, like lay it out like a wine offering. And there's a sense of like giving my heart to God first in his kingdom. But like Jesus, he was aware that people are people, and we want to build, and we need to learn to build slowly, incrementally relationships, and have trusted relationships. And I'm thankful for those. And I think that's such an important thing, that we can be real. But like, we're just not promised and guaranteed that we're not going to get hurt again. And I think that's part of the reality, unfortunately, that we live in on this side of the new heaven and new earth.
Yeah, that's a really good reminder to identify with Christ.
Mhm.
And I think that's so key. What would you say is, a primary mistake that leaders make when trying to cultivate community?
I think we make lots of mistakes. But I think there are a number of them. One is, Martin Luther King said that the end is pre-existent in the means. And I think quite often we forget that. And in sort of going for a goal, we just sort of use any means possible or any means necessary. And that's just not the case for building community. In building community, the vision of community has to inform how we do it. And so if leaders think that they can kind of skip that and just kind of do whatever it takes, they're going to miss the goal. They're going to fragment and fracture the community along the way, trying to actually build it, because they haven't attended to allowing the vision, the end, to inform how they get there. I think sometimes leaders don't realize how much their behavior matters. And JR was saying that, in some ways, about building relationships and being able to bear the betrayal. I think people are watching leaders. They don't have a lot of good models. And so they do look to the leaders. And if leaders don't realize that how they treat their spouses or their friends or their staff, that people are actually noticing that and learning from it, then there's going to be trouble very quickly. And so I think those are concerns. I think another thing, and this goes back to the idealization of community, I think leaders tend to overpromise. They make promises because we get captured by our own visions in some way, and we overpromise, and then people are disappointed. So I think, again, sort of a truthfulness about ourselves, and then also about what we're trying to build together, is important. Yeah, let me just note one more thing. Another thing I think leaders mistake, lots of people, not just leaders, imagine that community is somewhat like the high that comes off of being on a good retreat together. What you can kind of build in 3 days and everybody's happy and sings together and everything. And community is so much more than that, and so much more complicated, so much better than that in some ways, but also so much messier and slower and all of that. So again, I think you have to be careful about the kind of expectations both you have and you sort of pass on to the community.
Yeah, and I just want to tag on to the one element. I think, especially for leaders, if we think that instruction is more important than imitation or example, then we will go drastically wrong in this. People essentially, just to agree with you, like Christine, is like, people do what we do, not what we talk about, not what we preach about. So there is an element of preaching, as you kind of gave, we're trying to give a sense of hopefulness of where we can be in Christ. And yet, like, there's also the importance of a communicator and leader to be honest and have appropriate vulnerability for the different levels of, you know, community that they have. And but ultimately, yeah, I mean, as you kind of talk about, Christine, it's like Peter, you know, was writing to his fellow elders, you know, ultimately be an example was, you know, in the midst of kind of where you can be domineering, where you can be in ministry for wrong, you know, your own gain. And so this isn't a new problem, like,
Right.
you know, but he's kind of, the answer is be an example, which to me kind of is insightful because Paul's always saying, you know, follow me as I follow Christ. And I personally believe that imitation is more core to how people learn than instruction, and both are needed. But we just have to be in community ourselves, and we have to then be honest with how we're doing in that, and growing in that ourselves. Because again, like I would say from a church planner perspective, until I was able to build and participate with God in building a community of people who trusted each other, who are learning to love each other, who have faith toward the future, we didn't have anything to offer people. I mean, but once we had that, once we kind of had a level of unity and faith, nothing was impossible for us. What God was able to do in and through us was absolutely amazing. But it took like years to get just to that community of trusting people. It's like, how long do I have to wait, Lord? It's like, you know, but in time, you know, after 5 years of hell, there was like 7 years of heaven, at least for me. And and then you know, the next church plant was another 5 years of hell. I don't know why, you know, that's just my experience, but like, it's definitely a mixed bag, but I feel like that for me, from a church planner perspective, it's all about building that first community. Without that, I don't have anything to invite people into. No matter how great of an evangelist I am, if my community's poor, I don't want to bring anybody to it if we don't know how to resolve conflict and just do normal things that we should be doing under the headship of Christ. Like we wouldn't have anything better than to offer people than what they can get elsewhere, and maybe with less you know, less expectations.
Right. I think, at least in the research that I've done, one of the places where there are the most tensions and failures really is in how staffs operate together and don't realize that also is, so leaders don't take very good care of their staff, or imagine that staff members are just means to an end. And so I think that becomes crucial, maybe not at the very beginning because you don't necessarily have a big staff, but you do have sort of a beginning cohort of people as you plant a church.
Sure.
And I think being really careful to nurture those relationships and care for those persons is really crucial. And I think our tendency is to kind of imagine that that what we're looking for is more like flashy than fidelity, and yet fidelity is what's going to get us through the hard parts and sort of the slow building that is needed for establishing trust and long-term community, I think.
Yeah, you know, and I was reminded, like, I was coming to speak to a church that was asking me to do a couple days with them on things related to shared leadership, and I was picked up by one of the guys who was the assistant pastor, and I was staying with the guy whose title was senior pastor. And as I was talking with this guy, and, you know, I just about started to wonder why they invited me, because, like, he says he had never been inside of his senior pastor's house.
Wow.
And I'm like, what? It's like,
Wow.
I was just shocked. And it's like, why are you guys having me come and talk on this? Because maybe he wanted something more than what was being offered. But I'm just shocked how we think we can actually, you know, a core part of what the whole church is as a body, as a community, as a family of God. And if we haven't learned to live family as leaders, like, there's not much we can offer, you know.
Right.
Definitely. You know, and speaking of family, we don't pick our family members, we kind of inherit them. And so, but we can pick our friends and we can pick our communities. People seem to, in general, rally around affinities. which can sometimes make for homogenous communities. How do we stir up hospitality and make room for people that are unlike us when it comes to community?
It's a good question. I think we can start by recognizing that a diverse community is part of the witness of the power of the gospel. And so I think actually there needs to be some significant teaching on it, that right from the start of the church, people noticed that people from different tribes and backgrounds ate together and cared for one another. And that was a testimony in the first centuries. And it's a testimony today that people make new kinship ties with people who are really different. So part of our witness to the world is being able to do this. And there's really no getting around that. I think sometimes we live in kind of monocultural communities and it takes a little bit more work. And we need to ask ourselves, who's missing from our community? You know, whose absence is keeping us from being whole? And sometimes all we have to do is look around at our larger community, and we know that. Oftentimes, I think we could build on what diversity there is in communities and just say, okay, where, you know, what could we be doing that we could, or what are we already doing that we could build on? Because you don't start from nowhere. You know, you build relationships. It comes relationally. I think it does have to be modeled by the leadership. Again, if you want a richly diverse community, then the leadership has to really want it and they have to be living it. And I think that means it also has to be reflected in the leadership of the community. You can't just talk about it. I mean, some of the leaders, it needs to be a mixed leadership team pretty early on if you're going to build a diverse community. And I think we have to pray that God will open our eyes to the opportunities that we are given every day to build communities that welcome people that are, you know, that welcome people, but that are also built out of people who are different from ourselves.
Yeah. I mean, and for me, like, I just want to accent that because, like, from Pentecost at the beginning of the church to the picture of the future with people from every tribe, tongue, and nation together, like that's kind of that's the picture that is very exciting to live into. In my, you know, I kind of grew up in different places. So my dad was in the Navy for 20 years, but I got in an early age. I was in Japan for like 2.5 years, and I think for whatever reason that early experience really kind of, I love just kind of meeting people who are different than me. And I remember in our church plant moving from Virginia to LA and taking a team with me. We were supposed to have an agent contingency of another church come and join us, and that some things happened where in the end it didn't seem like it was the best for them to come. So we came as like this, you know, a couple of dozen young and pretty much very white group when you come into a very mixed LA, you know, in East Hollywood, LA. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this is like horrible. You know, it's just like, but for me, like, and it did come down to, like, I was excited to meet people. And so I really, because I love meeting different people, like all of my best friends became people that looked different than me, that came from different places than me, that had from different socioeconomic backgrounds than me. In fact, it was very interesting in I moved into like I would say the other side of the tracks of Hollywood. You know, Hollywood is not that glamorous at all anyway, but like I was on even the unglamorous part of the unglamorous Hollywood, the real Hollywood. We call it the Hollywood, but like, my apartment complex was pretty rough. And you know, I didn't know if there was going to be 2 people living next to me or 20 people living next to me, because it was, you know, it wasn't monitored very much. We didn't have a manager at that time. And yeah, I found like the people were so friendly. It was so easy to get to meet people. There was, it was just a blast. We would have these little dinner parties that would go from apartment to apartment. And like, and then we got, a new owner came and upgraded everything, put like $30,000 into every apartment, and the clientele were quite different in the next stage of life, that it was really harder to get to know people. Mm-hmm. And I kind of realized it kind of goes back to that first question, where sometimes it's amazing what wealth does to create isolation in people, because I find, like, no matter where I go in the world, that it's those that have the least that tend to be the most hospitable, the most kind, the most welcoming, and the most friendly. And I kind of wonder, you know, if money doesn't start to make us start to guard our life in ways that really and protect what we have, as opposed to kind of willing to, you know, when sometimes we don't have much, you're open and to receiving more. And I think for me, like, there's nothing just better than meeting people from different cultures, different places, different backgrounds. And I think once you experience it, like, it's addictive.
I agree that it's really addictive and it's wonderful. I think in building community, it's also really challenging.
Yeah,
Because
definitely.
people do bring different backgrounds and different assumptions, and sometimes we're trying to do things together without being clear about what assumptions are at work. And so
Yeah,
there can be real challenges and tensions in building that. So again, you're weaving the fabric of community, but you're having to do it thread by thread. And it is more challenging. I mean, there's lots of different kinds of diversity, and each one brings slightly different challenges. That's not to say we shouldn't do it or that it isn't the best thing ever, but it's also a really difficult project.
yeah,
Mhm.
absolutely.
Well, I want to just we've got another question that I'd like to ask, but I want to make sure that everyone knows, if you have a question as it pertains to this theme of life together and how do we do life together in a fragmented world and society, and I want to invite you to drop your question into the Q&A box, and we will, in just a few minutes, be able to discuss some of the questions that you may have. You know, Dr. Pohl, if you were a, church planter, what practices would you start right away to cultivate life together? You have the opportunity to start something from scratch and to set a tone for a culture. What would you recommend?
I think I would start with eating meals together. I think sharing meals is just a fundamental aspect of hospitality and community. And I think that that's a situation, a setting that everybody needs to eat. And so there's some kind of generalized community that happens there. I think when that's combined with ongoing conversation, you have the beginnings of the community. So I would say that in the hospitality tradition, the two main features are shared meals and shared conversation. And that's probably where I would start. I think early on, I would encourage people to sort of share what their notions of community are. I mean, I would begin a conversation about the things that they hold dearest, and get people to tell their stories. That's such a powerful thing where people begin to understand, especially if it's a diverse community, where people begin to understand what other people are bringing into the group. And I think mostly community emerges as a byproduct. So I would encourage doing things together, whether that's worship or it's work in the neighborhood or some shared project out of which relationships are built and so on, rather than putting an inordinate amount of pressure on kind of building community with a disparate group of people initially. I think I would probably also encourage people to talk about what they want of their first commitments to be. What are the promises they want to make to one another? These can be pretty minimal, but it will be the beginning. I mean, communities are based on the promises people make to one another. So what is it that we're committing to? And again, it doesn't have to be really fancy or anything, but at least get it out there of what people are trying to do together. That's where I would start probably.
Yeah, I like that. I probably echo many of those same things. I remember, yeah, and just kind of by way of experience, I remember in LA when we were just, we had multiple communities going, but I was also going to just start another mid-sized group. And all I did was like invite a few people, Christian or not Christian, didn't really matter. We started with like 4 people, and all we did was have dinner, and one person shared their story.
Mm-hmm.
And the way they were sharing was like, what are like 4 moments of your life? And so literally at the beginning, hours, and we didn't have really a time limit. Maybe we should have, but like took a long time. And the next, we literally did this for about 6 months until our group was about something. We just kept on adding people. We didn't do anything to try to add people. It's just like people were hungry to come to have a meal and to share the story and to hear someone's story. And we moved on to other practices after that. But like, I like to think about communion, community, and commission, like the 3 elements of what makes the core, what it does. And that being out together, you know, and like aspect of mission. I think there's also not just the praying, but playing together, because I think you together with your family. And sometimes if it's just mission and just prayer and just those things, who's the family that something like, I mean, you know, whether it's silly games or whatever, like the connection that comes in some of those times is pretty remarkable as well. I would say that for the planter, maybe the best thing to keep in mind is like what piece of furniture is the most important. And I always like, I did an article once, like what was Jesus' favorite piece of furniture? And I kind of make the case that the table was his favorite piece of furniture. It's where he taught his disciples. It's where he ultimately, you know, got sent to the cross because of who he ate with and his table manners. And I think the table wasn't just something that was done with his close community of disciples, but it was also done with those he was trying to make connection with that were outside and despised by others. And so this, if the table, as Christine was kind of saying, the eating is like the table should be more central than the pulpit. I think if we want to actually know how to build communities, they both have a place, but I feel like for Jesus, the table was more important than the pulpit, and maybe that's a good metaphor to keep in mind.
Wow, that's a huge nugget. The table more important than the pulpit. I also want to circle back to something you said, Christine, about the promises we make to each other. So we have a question from our audience, and it was saying about the expectations around Christian gatherings. What is a way of setting good expectations? What is a good way of setting expectations for believers in these gatherings? From believers that are close and know a little of what to expect, all the way through believers who are brand new to the idea of community.
Yeah, I think that's, you know, part of it. It's a challenge gathering around meals in terms of expectations. It's a challenge gathering as a community around expectations. And I think communities solve that question differently. Some communities that I've worked with lay a lot of expectations and rules out right in the beginning, and then actually back off of them in a sense, but sort of let people know what's going on, and then you know are looser than they sort of sound like they're going to be. Other people sort of discover the expectations along the way. My guess is that generally it needs to be sort of a combination where we talk about the most fundamental things of what's required for this community to be able to function at all. So if there are expectations about people taking turns bringing food or the kinds of food they'll bring, I think that's just a matter of truthful discussion, but also at the same time somewhat sensitive to different cultural expectations and so on. But I think that's something that communities sort of negotiate internally. But it's just like a family. Some families have a lot more sort of rules laid out. Other ones sort of discover them along the way and so on. I think that's true with communities too.
Mm.
Great, that makes a lot of sense. And so still on the theme of expectations, we do have another question from our audience, which is how, about the idea of a lot of church people entering in with critical attitudes. So how do you negotiate that? And what are some of the reasons why people have higher or lower expectations about certain things, like certain music, or, you know, why is there such a spectrum and a level of criticism, higher criticism in a Christian context versus when you go to a play or an event, there may not be as much criticism?
I think part of it has to do with seeing ourselves as consumers and expecting our tastes to be catered to. And that really doesn't work very well in community. I think there has to be, I mean, in a sense, we do lay down our lives for one another. And that includes our taste and our preferences sometimes, in a way in which everybody's preferences are taken seriously to a certain extent, but we're still continually kind of laying down our lives for one another. I was going to say something else and I forgot what the question. Just remind me of the question.
Maybe what are some of the reasons why there is a level of critical view within
I think the other thing I would say is that communities have to be founded in gratitude and grace. And that needs to sort of be with the leadership and then all the way through, where we are just making a practice of expressing gratitude and affirmation. And really, not in a way that silence is justifiable criticism, because there's a place for that. But there's also a really important place for enjoying one another, being grateful for the differences and the difficulties, and really setting a different tone that says, no, you know, our primary role is not to be critics. That's part of it, but not the main one. I think we're trained to look for problems and solve them. But that is not the only thing we need to be doing in the community. We need to be building each other up.
Yeah, and I think you know, to add on, like if we kind of receive from the world like our identity as a consumer, which we're always told we are, and we are in one sense, but that's obviously not our foundational identity. So I think we need to at the core of when we build community is remind ourselves of who we are in Christ. You know, the very simple thing that we're children of God. Is such a beautiful picture. We're children beloved by God. That's something like everybody can be excited about. It doesn't matter what your circumstances, what your situation is. God loves me. He cares about me. He's died for me. Like I want that to be an overflowing aspect of my life. But then there's also, you know, many other things like God's, you know, we're missionaries, we're priests, we're and there's like there's a giving and taking. And so I think that I think that we have to be willing, like, what are we giving to a community and what are we receiving? And there needs to be a good, healthy balance of that. And I think, speaking to Christine's thing, leaders in the core of the community, those who are most committed to Christ, are the most ones that need to give up their preferences because that's kind of being an example. And I would say I'd rather give up my preference, you know, for the person who's learning about community and joining it and becoming a part of it, as opposed to expecting that from them, you know? And so that's, and again, like, I think part of the beauty is like when we do that, we experience life in a fresh way, in a new way. And God kind of amazes us because like, you know, the whole idea of like, where in the Gospels, you know, Jesus says, you know, if you wish to come after me, you know, he wishes to come after me, deny himself, take up his cross daily, in order, not that to lose your life, but in order actually to find your life. Mm-hmm. You know, there's an element of self-denial that's maybe not out of love, that doesn't do any good. But if our denying ourselves is out of the love for the other, for God and for the kingdom, then that's actually where we thrive ourselves in life. We're become life-giving people to others, and others, and then not only that, but we realize even when someone is, you know, I remember like sometimes I can go to like a coffee shop, and if, you know, if someone who's supposed to be serving me, you know, my coffee is rude, I could take the thing like, how could you do that? You know, like, you're supposed to be serving me. But like, I usually try to think like, what's happened in their life before I met them that has caused them to be in this position, and how do I kind of bless them so that maybe I can be a part of turning them around. And maybe a real practical thing, and I like to think about is like, God, like every day is like, God, like, you bless me, like, who can I bless today? In a very concrete, tangible, it could be a very small way, but God has sent me to be a blessing to the world. Like, how can I bless somebody in my life today? Maybe it's just one little concrete practice that makes life a little bit more exciting.
You know, there are a couple other really, really good questions that I hope we can unpack. You know, what do we say and how do we handle um, believers who feel like they have enough community already within the context of family that might not be a part of the church? And they feel like they don't need community through the church. How do we encourage an understanding that fellowship of believers is important? And how do we help inspire their desire towards that?
That's an interesting question. I think it would partly involve teaching that really does say that the church and the community of the church is simply an important aspect of the Christian life, and that your family is not enough. And there's a way of making an idol of family that we have to be careful of. And I think that partly has come about because families are so fractured and so vulnerable at this point that we've kind of overstated the value. Families are terribly important, but our identity is as the body of Christ, and so family's not enough. And I don't know. I mean, I guess it would be partly showing people the blessing of being part of a larger community. I think at the same time, when families are under assault, it means that the church community also has to attend to the needs of the family and not set itself up sort of in competition, but in as much as possible, draw the whole family into the church.
Yeah. And that's right. I mean, it's always kind of like good things can become idols, you know, and they become the like most important. And I think then they become a kind of quite different than what they were intended to be, you know. And anything that becomes an idol starts to mess up the actual thing that you want to protect. And so I think maybe if we actually want good families, you know, we can't make the family an idol, because that will actually destroy the family. God has to be supreme, and I think we have to realize, you know, I look at Jesus, he basically redefined family, like who is my mother, who's my brothers, those who do the will of God. And we have a mission that goes beyond our, you know, our family. If we don't take our family on mission, I think again we limit, and I mean, we're actually just not faithful to the calling that we have in God. And I think that there's a lot of families. I remember, because I didn't grow up in a Christian home. Like I came to faith right before my senior year in college. And I remember the first talk I was given to a bunch of, like a Christian high school who kind of grew up in the church. It felt like they came up from such protective families that a lot of them, it was one of the most stale environments that I had to ever speak in. You know, I would rather just about speak with a bunch of non-Christians at that time. And like, but I realized as I started to look at that, is like how many families are about kind of protecting instead of helping their families live in the mission of God. And those who lived on the mission, I think actually their kids ended up, you know, being more tight with the family as they went along, as opposed to those who didn't, who sometimes just rejected what they experienced because they weren't experiencing everything that we're called to do. And if we're not doing what we're called to do, and we grow inward, it's usually not a good thing. So I think sometimes maybe there's a little deception at work there. And I hear that's the tension, is like we're to love our families, but realize that really kind of to try to protect families to grow and develop, but to realize that the first family is under God, and it's a bigger collective, and it has a mission element to it. And there's always a little bit of tension between community and mission, but I think that we can keep enough relationships tight that we can continue, that we always need to make space for a few new ones. I think to be faithful to the mission, like we're going to have to let go of some things to move into others, but I think there's always a few that we can keep very long-term over the long haul. But it's going to be different at different times. And we just have to think about how Jesus defined family and live into our mission, as well as honor and really honor our parents and the places that God has put us.
Mm-hmm. Well, Dr. Christine Pohl, thank you so much for joining us today. We want to make sure that everybody on the call knows, one, stay tuned to your email because this webinar will be sent out for your further review. We want to thank JR for participating in this conversation. And also, we are going to be having a conference, the Praxis Gathering event. Our annual event is happening in September the 27th, the 26th through the 28th in Philadelphia. We are going to be looking at this topic, Life Together in a Fragmented World, and Dr. Christine Pohl will be one of the speakers that we will be able to spend some time with. So we want to make sure that you have that on your calendar. Stay tuned for that, and we want to thank you. We look forward to being with you on our next webinar.